Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of Iblis Manifestations podcast. Today's episode is going to be a very special one, as this is a particular subject that has been of utmost fascination to me personally, and I think that there are a lot of very important conversations and discussions that we all, as people of this planet, need to be having about it. Before we continue into today's episode and discussion, there's one thing that I want to make very clear, and this is a disclaimer, that I am not at all, in any way, shape, or form, making recommendations of the use of any illegal substances. So I make that clear from the get-go, and that is not just for my own safety, but for your own safety as well, because I do not want the listeners of this podcast to get into legal troubles. So please do not, under any circumstances, if you happen to live in a state or a country where any of the substances that are going to be mentioned on this episode are illegal, stay away from them. And do not take what I say as any form of recommendation. What I'm going to be sharing here are merely examples of my own past experiences and what I learned from them, and my main reason for sharing these are educational purposes. Okay? The only thing I have ever recommended on this podcast are A, getting in shape and fitness and good diet, or B, some good music. And of course, I am happy to help out you guys for both of those things as well. So if you're after coaching or a diet plan, hit me up. And if you're after some good music, there are plenty of great guests that have appeared on this podcast thus far. Or if you're interested in what I do personally, in addition to that, you can keep an eye out for the upcoming Trivax single as well as the full album. So keep your eyes peeled on that. That will be all shared on the Iblis Manifestations pages as well. But once again, in conclusion, I am making this very clear. This is not a recommendation for you to use any illegal substances. Now, ladies and gentlemen, today's episode is one where I will be talking about my experience with psychedelics. Psychedelics are essentially a group of various different substances which are known for their mind-altering effects, and there are various different types of them, and this can be anything from LSD, psilocybin, peyote, and of course DMT. And there are, of course, various other types of psychedelics as well, such as kratom. I guess MDMA still lands within that to some extent, and there are lots of various other types of these types of mind-altering substances. So why is it that I want to talk about this? Well, first of all, my personal experiences with these things have been absolutely life-changing, life-altering. Why? Because they changed me as a person. And I'm going to get into the absolute details of why and how these things had such impact on me, very profound impact, in fact. From the moment I took my very first LSD dosage and the experiences that I had from that, pretty much everything changed. And there's a lot of both personal anecdotes as well as scientific data that very much backs up these types of experiences. So, as a general disclaimer also, and then this is just from my own personal take, really, for anyone wondering of the depths of what it is that I'm reporting on here at the moment, I personally, at this moment in time, in fact, pretty much within the last 4 years or so, I would say, I have mostly spent my time as a straight edge. And in the last 2 years, it has been pretty consecutive. Now, I know this might come as a surprise to those who do not know me personally, but I do not drink alcohol. I do not smoke cigarettes, nor any different types of tobacco, although I kind of don't mind cigars. They're pretty fucking cool. I do not smoke marijuana or weed. I do not, at this moment in time, take any psychedelics, and I also do not take any cocaine or speed. In fact, unlike most of my fellow musician friends, I absolutely fucking despise those particular substances, particularly cocaine. And I've had a very tough experience, actually, of turning it down from some of my favorite bands. Of course, I do not judge the people who use it, but I have my own reasons for why I dislike it, and perhaps I can elaborate on that later, but that's merely a personal opinion, as I guess a lot of what I'm about to share is, but some of these things do tie in with science, as well as the experiences of other people, and perhaps what has shaped a lot of our history as human beings. So, of course, I'm going to get into all of that. So, one general misconception with psychedelics, whether you're someone who has ever tried them before, or someone who's regularly using them, or someone who's never even touched anything like that in their life, there's one general misconception, and it's, from my understanding, it's the aspect that, due to the fact that they are illegal and they are classed as drugs, they get put in the same box as several other types of substances, for example, cocaine, as I mentioned. So, if you're someone who's experienced both of these things, there's a huge fucking difference between taking a line of coke or having 3 grams of mushrooms. It is so profoundly different that it is not even, like, it blows my mind that these things are even put in the same box or criminalized in the same way. It is very strange and very bizarre, and I actually, personally, I think this is very unfortunate as well. Now, we can talk about the general idea of legalization and the taxation of these things, and how having that is something that can then help with the funding, as well as the general freedom for things such as rehabilitation facilities and just treating people with addiction in a better and more efficient ways. But I guess those are the conversations for perhaps a politician to be having on here or something. But for me personally, it is preposterous that they are criminalized, and put in the same box as one another. And of course, I'm referring to something like psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, DMT, and how they are criminalized in the same way as something like cocaine, speed, meth, and so on. So that's really the type of thing I'm talking about here. And there's one more issue with this as well that I do like to point out to before I get into my personal stories of these things, and it's the fact that when you live in a certain culture where certain things are put in the same box, then you assume that by your willingness of trying one thing, then you find yourself be willing to try everything else as well, which I think is the wrong approach. And I think that's probably the approach that most people around the world who ever take any form of these mind-altering substances end up doing. So what do I mean by that? For example, a lot of people say that weed is the gateway drug. So you could start smoking weed, then that makes you open to try other things. Yeah, maybe you could try psilocybin, you could try LSD, all these different things, but at the same time, mentally, because you've opened yourself to the fact that you are having certain illegal substances, then you could still find yourself having other substances such as cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and so on. And that I don't think is a very good thing, because the reason is that a lot of psychedelics do have medicinal aspects to them. Now, of course, they are very powerful tools. And that's a very important part of it, actually, is that they are tools for accessing parts of the consciousness as well as the subconsciousness in a way which we are not permitted to or capable of reaching in normal circumstances, unless we are absolutely equipped to do so via ways of meditation, breath work, lucid dreaming, and so on, or even dream incubation and things like that. It is a very, very powerful experience that once you are opened up to it, and you will simply not be able to see the world the same way as it is again. So that's my general introduction on these psychedelics and what I think of them. And I think that you can probably tell from now that I very much stand in the school of these things being more so educationally available. I think actually on a mainstream degree, because there's something that I feel under the right settings could do a lot for humanity as a whole. And as I take you through my personal stories of these things, you will perhaps begin to understand why I think that, even though not all of those experiences were inherently positive ones. In fact, I had some pretty terrible ones too. Not all of them, of course. I had some beautiful moments as well, but I actually think that those tougher experiences also taught me a lot about myself and the world in general. So, let's get started on this. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I fucking really appreciate you joining me on Bliss Manifestations podcast. As you can see, this is very unfiltered and true, and I'm hoping to be as transparent as I possibly can be with this, with the earlier disclaimer in mind, of course. So, let's get this started. For me personally, I grew up in the Islamic Republic of Iran, as everyone is probably aware by now, and that is where I spent almost the first 2 decades of my life in, almost. And in that time, I did not really partake in any kind of substances, and the main reason for that was simply just because it's not legal, it's not allowed, it's very, very frowned upon. The only thing which I did experience in Iran was alcoholic beverages, which, by the way, are highly illegal over there, and the punishment that you get for them over there is far worse than you would get for any Class A drugs over here. Let me make an example. Over in Iran, if you are caught in possession of alcohol or intoxicated, your very first round of punishments is, I believe, 3 months in jail as well as 80 lashes. And that is only the first time. By the third time that they catch you with the same offense, they simply execute you as a criminal. So the reason for this is that Iran, since 1979, has been voted, allegedly, to be the Islamic Republic of Iran, and alcohol goes against Islam for various reasons. It is not halal, and therefore, in a society where it is a theocracy, you can get heavily punished for simply being intoxicated by the ways of alcohol. Which, by the way, ironically enough, was actually discovered by gentlemen in Persia many years prior to that. But that's a story for another day. So that was my experience growing up at first. And then upon moving to the UK in pursuit of continuing my music and performing black metal over here without any kind of limitations, which again I understand many of you have probably already heard the story by now, but I think it is worth probably acknowledging that it's unusual circumstances to be doing such a thing. So once I moved to the UK and I knew that I had free access to alcohol and I could drink it as much as I could, I did exactly that purely because I found it to be a way of rebellion against all of the people in Iran who prevented me from doing as such, and it was something that no longer put my life in danger, at least in the way that I was used to it doing so. This led to, on one hand, whilst it felt very much like a personal liberation, it did not lead to very good experiences at all. In fact, I have some terrible experiences in my life because of alcohol. No doubt it applied some degree of brain damage or liver damage in some sorts, because it is one of the worst drugs on the planet, in my opinion, and of course I don't say this with a view of cultural judgment towards those who partake in it, none whatsoever. It's just from my own personal experiences and what it brings out of me, and I mean, to be honest, generally what I have seen it bring out of people. I'm not a fan of alcohol at all. I don't like being around it, and I'm not a fan of how it is normalized. But again, I will not judge nor stop someone else from doing it. I am simply speaking my own truth over this matter. So my experience with that was very damaging once I managed to get into it. I never had any kind of addictive tendencies. I have never had any addictive tendencies over anything. I've more just been simply obsessive. So I can get into something and then I can obsess about it, and then it's almost like I'm trying to squeeze everything that thing has within its fountain of experiences to give me. And this is generally what I've always been like with the things that I enjoyed or wanted to explore in my life. Now, when it came to marijuana, I first experienced that, I believe, around the time I was 18 or 19 years old. This was with the first drummer in Trivax, who was actually from Iran, and I had reunited with him one day, and I met him for the first time after a long time of being away, and obviously after a long time of actually breaking up the old lineup of Trivax and then reforming the one in the UK. And I got to try it, and I didn't really know actually that it had the effect on me that it did. I was simply just living through it, and it was only after I realized the sheer amount of chocolate milk that I had devoured through, that it was as an effect of the drug, that I had found myself in that position. And it was sort of like a very slow aha moment of, oh, okay, yeah, I forgot I did that, and this is probably why it happened. So it was kind of like the anti placebo effect, if you will. So that is something that I carried on doing quite a lot by the time I was around 20 years old. And just like as I mentioned just a moment ago, it is something that I feel like I very much overdid. And because I was under the impression that, oh yeah, it's just good for you, that was the information that had been passed down on me. I did not find it addictive. No, not at all. But I did realize that the people that were surrounding me, and a lot of people who I had sort of paid attention to and observed. Because I've always been an observer. I'm always an observer of character. And one very interesting thing that I noticed about marijuana in particular was that a lot of people who smoke it, they do so because they want to chill out. They want to de-stress. Yet I noticed that the quote-unquote stoners that I knew were always the most stressed out people that I also knew at the same time. And this was very interesting to me and very peculiar. And I came to the conclusion, obviously still at a relatively young age, that the reason for this was because obviously on one hand, you're putting yourself in a state of somewhat of an incubation mode, and when you're doing so, you're not really alert. So when you're trying to switch back into a state of being alert, which in real life you fucking need that, you're not meant to just sit around and just fucking chill and fucking stargaze all day. As valuable and beautiful as that can be, that's not what it's just not what we are even wired to do, and I think that it was also the thing of, well, you find comfort in that de-stressing mode, so anything that's not that stresses you out. So in short, I think it's something that makes you weak. Of course, it has very positive benefits to it as well, but I noticed that since I had made it a regular thing in my life, and since at that time particularly I was already lacking quite a bit of discipline, it wasn't a very good thing, like you could say that on one hand it can make you creative and whatnot, but at the same time I very much felt like it just made you fragile, made you distracted, and yeah, again, I do not judge people who use this substance. Do I think it should be illegal? Fuck no, that's so stupid. Like, it's an obvious question. Of course it should be legal, but I also don't think it's this amazing life-changing thing either. Perhaps for some people it has been. It's known to have a lot of positive effects medically. I am absolutely aware of all of those things, but for me personally, I don't think it matches my personality. I'm a pretty intense guy, and I'm obviously only saying this because people tell me that I am. So it's one of them. To each their own, but that was my experience with marijuana. And why do I even bother mentioning this? Because it's important, because that's the one that, as I alluded to earlier, once you have that, you've lifted that kind of barrier within your own mind where you think, okay, I'm already having something that technically you're not supposed to have, so now it's okay to do all the other things that you're not supposed to have, which I will now get into. So up until now, you now know of my opinion on certain of these particular substances. You know where I stand on them. You know my approach currently speaking. I don't know how much you guys will relate to this. If any of you have ever used any of these substances before, please do feel free to let me know in the comments if you've used them as well, if you've had a different experience, or if you had a similar experience, and so on. Feel free to let me know of that. But now, I want to get into the one that changed me completely. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was LSD. LSD is a substance that, first of all, has a very fascinating history, based on the person who discovered it, and there's a very infamous bicycle ride, which I'm sure you guys can look up. It's a very fascinating story, but I am just gonna talk purely about my experiences with it. So this was, I believe I was 19 years old. In fact, I know I was 19 years old because I'm so fucking good about dates. When I'm saying roughly, I am just bullshitting because I don't want to make you guys feel bad for how young I actually am. But I know exactly when it was. I know all of the dates. I am extremely meticulous about remembering dates. In fact, it was January 2014, which means it will have been 2 months after my 19th birthday, and the experience was one that it blew my fucking mind completely. Now, I think I only took like 1 tab of acid, but I don't know if it had some kind of a hyper reaction with my mind, or if it's just always meant to be like that and people just handle it and they're okay. I don't fucking know, but basically this was a very positive experience, but it changed the wiring in my brain completely, because this was the first time, like literally within hours, I came to discover how everything in this realm, in this world, is made of energy. and that there is traces of life in everything, and how we are made of the same things, and that there are different dimensions and there are different realms within this world. Now, of course, if you've never been there, this perhaps might seem quite abstract. However, I am going to make an attempt at trying to explain this and explain how perhaps these things are accessible even without the use of some of these psychedelics, or at least I would think so anyway. So, for me, one of the most fascinating parts about it was this. It's sort of like, when you experience something like that, what it does is that you have these boxes that are already buried within your DNA and within your subconscious mind. And what this particular substance does is it just runs around like a fucking maniac and starts opening up all of these boxes of information that already laid within your mind and within your DNA coding. And then you come to certain truths. One of the most fascinating and profound truths, and a highly philosophical one, which I reached during this very first trip, was simply the fact that, like, one thing that a lot of people talk about in psychedelics is ego death, which is when essentially it feels like you are dying because your perception of yourself reaches zero. However, you are not actually dying. That's just a perception of you, and that is something that can be healthy for a lot of people, albeit somewhat devastating as well. So the ego death is something that you should definitely check out, look into, and you will almost always hear that people who experience psychedelics also experienced some degree of ego death. Now, my first run-in with that was that I was already, until that point, always fascinated with the stars. And when we were going through this trip, it was my friends, one of my friends from Norway and myself, in my uni campus in the Midlands in UK. And we were outside and we were looking at the sky, and I was looking at the stars and feeling their weight and their power and the life that was once behind them. Because I was already aware by that point that the light that was reaching us was getting here so late that these stars have already died in the far distance. And I was looking at that, and one thing that always perplexed me about the bigness of the universe was how, when you look around you, it just feels like, oh, you are so small, you are nothing, you are this speck of dust in this vast ocean. But you know what was really beautiful about it? Because my understanding was somehow beyond that. My understanding was that, yes, you can look at it that way. However, that's, whilst it is in the direction of being a realistic view, it is not the entire view. And what I discovered from that was that whilst the world might be an infinite ocean, and it might feel like I am nothing in comparison to it, I am still all that I have. And that is a realization that I've carried with myself ever since. And this is something that I want you to at least ponder over. I want you to think about that. What does that really mean? Like for example, when you're on a plane and then you look down a city and everyone looks like little fucking ants, and you always think to yourself, well, maybe you guys don't, but I do, because I'm mildly crazy, but also very, I think I like to see the reason behind things too. For me, when I'm looking down and I see life, I always think to myself, think of the millions of different stories, the millions of moments of laughter and sadness and joy and grief and all of these things that people share, and how many people there really are. That's a concept that can make you feel very small in a sense that can, almost make you feel worthless. But my profound discovery was that, yes, that from an external perspective, you could say that that is true. It's not that it's not true, but what's even a more complete version of the truth is that at the end of the day, the body which you get to move around, the mind that you get to use, and everything, that's all that you have. So that's your world, and you must respect it in completely, regardless of how small you might think that is within the greater cosmos. And also, I think that is something that once you realize that you understand how you are connected to the greater cosmos as a whole, and this is a realization that you can't teach anyone. I am simply just sharing my perspective of it and hoping that perhaps it'll provoke some thoughts at the very least. But so this was, now coming back to the substance itself, this was my experience with LSD. There is one particular interesting fact about LSD, and it's the fact that once you've had it, it stays within your system for, I believe, something like over 70 years. And I could immediately tell that this was the case because the day after this trip experience that I had, I had a difficulty even falling asleep because I remember lying down in my bed and still, my friend he was sleeping on the floor because he was staying in my place. And I remember struggling to fall asleep because I could see all these shades of purple and green that were flashing around. And then somehow, for some reason, it kept reminding me of this vibe of late 90s South Park, which I cannot for the fucking life of me explain how. There were a lot of like very anecdotal visuals and things like that were involved in this, but it was a very interesting trip. Nevertheless, and like I said, it changed me. And what really was profound about LSD for me, but I can probably say that this applies to other psychedelics as well, is it made me far more compassionate person than I was. And this is not because a particular event or anything happened whilst I was on it. No, it's simply by making me aware of the pulsating energy which is at the absolute core of everything that is within our world, which, by the way, you could also speak about how that thing relates to God. And the structure of DNA and the structure of the universe and everything like that. You could point to that, but for me, just the simple fact that I knew that this energy was something that was inherently existent within myself. It existed in the world around me just as much as it did within myself, made me automatically more passionate towards other people. And again, this is an effect that I've carried with me since I had these experiences, because when I was a teenager, for example, I was a complete fucking asshole. I always had a chip on my shoulder anyway, due to various different experiences that I had, particularly relating to music and growing up in that environment in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I always say Islamic Republic because that should kind of give you an idea of the kind of shit that I ran into. But even just like, personal bullshit that I always had to deal with, it was this sort of weight that I always had on me, but I was always, when I reflect back at, how I was like when I was 14, 15, 16 years old, I was always extremely insensitive towards other people's feelings, other people's mannerisms, character. And this is only something that got better over time, but the initial ignition of me even beginning to care about other people in that way really, I feel, came from my first LSD experiences, where I truly intuitively became more sensitive towards other people and the effect that I can have over other people. Now, this is something that you don't want ruling over your life either, but it is a very, very profound impact nevertheless. So just coming around to the end of the LSD chapter, there was one particular issue that I had with this, and it's that so within about 2 months, I did LSD 3 times, and that sort of melted my brain at the time, and put me in somewhat of a traumatized state. This was simply due to the fact that I overdid it, and I overdid it under pretty rough circumstances. I'm just really just a very young, just a young adult, away from his home, away from family, with all these issues that had never been dealt with, on this absolutely obscure path of somehow actually trying to make it as a black metal musician of all fucking things. We could get into astrology, but if you want to talk about having a fucking Scorpio North Node, there you fucking go. That's just my life, and it is extremely obvious to me. And I'm not surprised by it. But the thing is that when you're surrounded by those kind of things, you have a lot of these pent up darkness within you and also surrounding you. Because I didn't really have any real friends at the time. I knew people, but I had no real friends. I didn't know anyone I could call friends, and this was the case for much of my first earlier years in the UK, so that third LSD experience kind of just fucking broke me down a little bit, and for a long time I was a bit traumatized, to the point of, let's see, I'll make the story very, very short and sweet, because there's still a lot I want to unpack here with you guys, and I of course appreciate you tuning in and listening thus far. But for me, there was one day where I was supposed to have a Trivax rehearsal, and I thought it'd be a fucking great idea if I dropped some acid before I showed up to fucking rehearsal. So I dropped acid maybe around 2-3 p.m., something like that. I can't remember, but I'm guessing it was around that time. And obviously this is somewhere around March, so England, it's fucking horrible weather as expected, and it's not really the best time to be doing such a thing. And I was on my own all day, and I did acid, and I went out and I was tripping really fucking hard. It came to rehearsal time, and I went there, and by the time I somehow managed to get on the bus, and I remember specifically that I was listening to Dissection's Storm of the Light's Bane album. Again, very weird choice to have on acid, and I went on the bus going, one of them double-decker buses you always see in England, and I went upstairs. As I sit upstairs, the headphones rip off out of my ears, and I reach down, and as I grab my headphones, that's when I realized that everything has gone wrong. I remember coming up slow motion and hearing really strange things on the bus behind me. It almost sounded like there was a swarm of fucking zombies behind me on the bus. And looking forward, I could feel this massive claustrophobia, because I could hear the metal of the bus creaking, and it felt like the roof was gonna collapse on me, as if it was somehow just getting closer. And just a quick tip for anyone who has ever experienced psychedelics, or might at some point in the future, providing not by the recommendation of this podcast, is that when you change settings, everything changes. So let's say, for example, you're in one room, you've got the lights on, and then you go in another room, and then it's a different decoration, different lighting. That changes everything. You are super hypersensitive to lights, colors, and all these things. And then if you do that, it is very intense. So what you want to do, you want to be surrounded in an environment that that even if you do change settings, you're going to be heading to places that you're going to feel comfortable, and you're going to feel at home and relaxed, and you can still continue being happy and almost kind of vulnerable, because you do feel very vulnerable on psychedelics, that's for sure. and for me to be on the top of that double-decker bus, having my headphones just ripped out of my ear, and now I'm hearing zombies and shit behind me, it was a very terrible experience. So basically what happened was, after 3 stops, I could not tolerate that anymore, and I ran off the bus. It ran off the bus, get it? And that was horrible. That was horrible, because then I had to walk back to my uni campus to find some kind of shelter. And I remember waiting outside this house that I was staring at for 10 minutes, because I was pondering if I should go knock the door and ask them to give me water or not. But then I was aware how strange I looked, considering that I had long hair at the time, leather jacket, and a bandana around my forehead. And I was like, I don't know if they're going to just call the police on me or something, you know. So that's the kind of place I found myself in, and the lack of friends really let me down at that time as well, because I had no one to call, which I found myself in a lot for many years after moving to the UK. But anyhow, that was my rough experience with that, and that had a pretty long-lasting traumatic effect on me. To the point where I could not walk past cars on the streets for like a good 4 or 5 months or so. So my reason for sharing this with you, both sides of the coin here, because I feel like the LSD one is extremely important. My reason for sharing that with you here is because I want you to consider the fact that whilst these things are very positive, they can have tremendous impact on you. They can also be pretty dangerous, because they are a tool. It's kind of like, let's say if you were in a world where you were dealing with some kind of magic, you know, that is something that you always see in these books or things like that, where you should only play with it if you know how to control it and if you know how to wield the power. I think psychedelics are very much like that, and you have to earn your experiences with them. And the way I look at it now is that you earn those experiences by routines, by regimens, by discipline, by knowledge, by education, and then perhaps you can dip your toes in the waters from time to time. So this is a very important thing, I feel. So anyhow, this was my experience with LSD, and I only did it one more time a couple of years after that, and I appreciate that these are all very detailed accounts, but I think it's important to share these different parts of it, just so you get an understanding of not just what's good about them, but also what's potentially harmful and dangerous about them as well. Okay, again, do I think this should be illegal? Fuck no, not at all. But this is exactly why we need to have settings where we are able to experience them with the right level of guidance, with the right dosage, with the right material. So, for example, you want to know that what you have got is pure and it is going to act the way that it is meant to act, rather than something that you get in a powder format from a stranger and you don't know what the fuck's in that. You know, that could very well be covered in something like fentanyl, which over in America is an absolute epidemic at the moment, and I believe it's the number one killer of all young adults at the moment, which is a fucking travesty, really. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Again, I'm quite militant about my stance on that, if I'm honest, but of course I'm always open to be challenged on that as well. You know, again, which you guys are welcome to do over the comment section here, which I do check out, despite being advised not to. So that's the LSD thing. Next, we're gonna be moving on to psilocybin, and the story for this won't be as long, but I am just simply going to explain what psilocybin is to me personally and why I think it is a fascinating substance. So psilocybin is something that very much grows out of the earth. It's basically magic mushrooms. That's what we know it as. So the thing that you've heard, that's what I'm about to talk about. So whether you've experienced this before or not, I think there's a very interesting observations about mushrooms that I had, and this is particularly interesting when you understand the way that fungi in general communicate with one another. Because one absolutely fascinating thing that I found about magic mushrooms or psilocybin is the ability to communicate without using words. So, what do I mean by that? If you look at the way fungi generally work, they have this very similar structure to us where they are able to form societies of their own, and then they somehow communicate via this invisible ways where obviously they are not using words or anything, yet they are somehow able to communicate with one another. Now, they are actually, I think, out of the other types of elements that are within nature, our minds and beings are far more similar to fungi than, say, for example, trees and vegetables and so on. And one very interesting thing that I found is that I tried psilocybin I think I've had it about 4 times, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, I know it is 4 times because I'm good at maths and I'm good at dates. I remember every single fucking thing ever. And this is exactly why you never want to get on my bad side, because I'll never forget shit, and I'll probably never let it go either. Of course, I am joking. Mostly. And, you know, the thing that I found very fascinating about it was that the second time I took psilocybin, I did this with the old guitarist in Trivax, and I think that was his first time trying them, and then my second time, you know, and obviously I was the fucking culprit, you know, who got him into it, but both of us ended up having this really fascinating experience, which was... What it taught me was that we both kept seeing the same effects. So I remember very vividly, actually, that we were at our old bassist's house. Trivax, as you see, has been through a few lineup changes since back then. We were at the old bass player's house, and at his dad's house, actually, and his father was always a great man and very supportive of us. And there was a Union Jack sort of a poster, like a 3D poster kind of thing on the wall. And when me and my guitarist were looking at this thing, just as we were coming up on these psilocybin mushrooms, we began to see exactly the same effects. And that was just something that went on from the start to finish of this trip, which was wild. I mean, I really want you to think about that, right? Just think for a moment, okay, there's 2 people that have just taken a substance. Now, this substance could translate itself in any way, yet they both see exactly the same things. And the effect was that this picture was vibrating and almost like kind of flashing on the wall. And then there were multiple other things where we would look at the neighborhood and everything kind of looked purple at first. And then the most fascinating fucking thing ever happened, which I have never forgotten since then. Basically, we decided to grab some guitars from the guy's room upstairs. We went downstairs and then we went out to the garden. And then him and I were playing guitar together. And then this weird synchronicity happened between him and I, where we were playing and we were just improvising. We were not playing anything. And actually, one of the riffs that we came up with ended up making it to the ending of the song Deathborn on the very first Trivax album. The outro riff of that song is what I took from that session. Which is why it sounds so different to everything else, probably on the whole album. And so what happened was we would be in the middle of the garden playing together. Then we would step far away from one another, playing to ourselves in the distance. And then we would come back after a few minutes, meet back in the middle, and we were playing the same song somehow. We were playing together, we were harmonizing. So what I'm saying is that this invisible communication that I strongly believe fungi could allow us to have by somehow merging with our consciousness, due to the way I think probably why and how mushrooms communicate with one another. I think that they can somehow unlock that within the human brain, and particularly when two humans enter this particular realm at once with the use of the same particular type of fungus, it created this moment of telepathy where we would be playing, going far off from one end to the other end of the garden, and we're playing unplugged electric guitar, so you cannot fucking hear that. You can hear that, what we're playing on the other sides of the garden, yet we were playing the same song, and this would be proven to us every time we stepped back towards one another and started carrying on playing. And this taught me a lot. And again, I feel like that was something that unlocked the superpower in my mind, where I've been much better at reading people and understanding their minds. I mean, I'm a menace to my girlfriend, actually, as well as my previous partner, because I can always read their minds. They'll be thinking something and I'll turn around and say, yes, I will do this in a moment. And they'll be like, what the fuck? How do you know what I was thinking? And I'm like, I know, I can hear your thoughts. And this is, I feel, again, this is something that only occurred to me. Well, perhaps I had some predisposition for it previously, but it is something that I unlocked further with the use of psychedelic mushrooms. And perhaps there's a lot of fascination to this, actually, because of things like I don't know if any of you guys might be familiar with the MK Ultra, for example, and the CIA, and how they actually did certain experiments on Charles Manson and taught him these techniques of controlling mind, which I can't say I've ever experienced anything like that, but what I took from psychedelics in my own experiences, I can see how that's a true thing. I never wanted to use these experiences as a form of dominance over other human beings, not at all, but I can see how you could manipulate someone into that. Does that make sense? Like there's a difference between the two, and then that's why, again, as this is why when I was speaking about them earlier, I referred to them as a tool, which I think is a very important one. So that is my experience of psilocybin, which I think is worth mentioning. Of course, there were other moments that I experienced with it as well, but this is really the most important part, is how it can allow for invisible communications between our minds and just what we are capable of learning from it in that regards. So, I guess the last substance which I want to talk about here is DMT. DMT is a very powerful substance which actually is found within all of nature, including our own minds and our own bodies. So DMT is something that we already have pre-existing in our minds. It is allegedly the molecule that is most present during birth and during death. And this is a compound which I believe is responsible for a lot of very interesting things within our world, and this, I believe, communicates and connects with a lot of very vivid religious experiences. And the reason for this is, in short, if you're not familiar with DMT, DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine, and this is, I would say, a 10 to 15 minute experience only. However, that is a 10 to 15 minutes that can last a lifetime, because you will enter a realm which feels more real than what real feels. So let's say wherever you are listening to this podcast right now, you look around you and you look at your own hands and your own feet, and you can wiggle them, and you can look around and you see these objects around you, and that's, I guess, that's kind of real, right? When you enter DMT realm, there's something behind it that feels more real, that makes what we're experiencing now, how should I say? Well, it is what it is. It just makes it seem like this is actually a dream. You will hear a lot of various different people report on having a similar perspective from their experiences. But one of the most interesting things that I had from it is that the first time I did it, I didn't really fully break through. And however, what I did experience was being in the same room where my body was sat on this couch in this shitty house I used to go to in West Midlands, and basically being able to swim around the room and have to come back to myself, and that my mind was separated from my body, and I had to swim back to myself to come back to consciousness. And this was something that I had already experienced when I was younger and around the age of 14. This is a story for another day, but I will explain briefly why I experienced that. But the main thing was that around the time between 13 to 14 years old, just as a test of willpower, I decided to become abstinent for 14 months, which I did so successfully. The only reason why I broke it is because I got back in touch with a crush of mine at the time, who had just, she was kind of my weakness. And, so I, in that time, developed very, very strange but very powerful experiences with sleeping and dreams. And a big part of that was that I ended up finding myself in the state of lucid dreaming, or I guess people call it astral projection, which I'm guessing it's the same thing, because I would find myself dreaming in real time, but I was able to move my mind across places during dreams. And every time I was in the same room, but I was floating by the ceiling, and then I would have to swim back to my body in order to wake up. And this all felt different to a normal dream. It was always very vivid, very clear, as if I could see with my own eyes the experience. And it was really fascinating to me. And obviously it's taken me some time to put a few of these dots together as well. I only experienced that as a teenager during a period of abstinence, which I was very, very hardcore about. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why my willpower has always been unbeatable as an adult. Like, if I set my mind to something, I'll fucking do it. There's nothing you can do that will stop me. And I have always been that way. And this, but back to the point, this was something that the first time I did DMT, I had that same experience again. However, this time it was induced by this chemical, which I found fucking really fascinating, and you hear that a lot as well about people who pass away. Dave Gone from Depeche Mode, if you listen to his take on when he had a near-death experience back in the 90s, before they released the Ultra album, he had a massive problem, and I think he had a brief overdose, I believe, on cocaine, and maybe cocaine and heroin. I think it might have been a combination of the two. Of course, I can't speak on his account, but I recall him saying that after this happened, he felt that he was floating on top of his body and looking back at his own body, and this was something that he was experiencing in that time. And and that this weightlessness, which is exactly what those experiences felt like, whether it was from when I was 14 years old doing this during that period of abstinence and strengthening my own spiritual condition, or simply the first time I took DMT as a 19-year-old and then got to do that. So very interesting area here for me, but of course that was not even me breaking through to DMT realm properly. The DMT realm is something that once you break through to properly, well, I don't know how to explain it. It's very hard to explain. And I'm convinced that even though I've had very profound experiences on it, I've still not broken through yet properly, which is something that, even though I'm a straight edge in today's world, a DMT and psilocybin are things that I would still be open to revisiting, mainly as they grow from the earth, and I somehow feel like I could trust them better, and I know certain diet hacks and things like that I can do that are more feasible. So, but the thing with DMT is that before I wrap up this part about the specific substances, is that with DMT, you enter a realm where a lot of people report seeing different elves and things like that, and meeting certain deities, or in fact meeting an omnipotent deity. And this is something that is very prevalent, and I believe in this. And to me, there's the question of, are you just hallucinating, or are you simply entering a different reality? I believe very strongly, after experiencing various different psychedelics, but also experiencing various different meditative states, but also, believe it or not, experiencing what I've experienced with Trivax, my band, on stage, and those altered states of consciousness which I reached purely just through the power of music and sound, that our perception of the world around us is limited. It is extremely limited. And because we only see that perception about 99.9999999% of the time, we forget that that's not the only perception of the world that exists, but that rather we only see the third dimensional world that is only going to aid us in a basic survival. However, that, ladies and gentlemen, I do not believe is everything. In fact, there are multiple different dimensions. And now you can get into the discussion about religion and Bibles and the Quran, and you can talk about the presence of demons, of angels, archangels, and various different things, which I am not making a case nor an argument for. However, what I am saying is that these psychedelic compounds are a gateway to a different reality. So it's sort of like, for a few hours that you're experiencing this thing, or 12 hours, or only 15 minutes, however long this is, you're removing your goggles through which you observe life, and you're given another pair. And that pair is supercharged and is fascinating. But what you see on there is not any less real than what you experience in normal circumstances. In fact, I believe that it's just as real as what you see in normal life. However, the reality that you see in that environment is only temporarily useful, because if you were to stay in that environment permanently, you would drift into absolute insanity. Which is why, once again, I think it is so crucial, it is so important that if we partake in psychedelics, we do so under the right guidance, under the right dosage, with the right person, in the right setting, with the right music playlist, all these things. It very, very, very much matters. So, that's my take on these things. Now, Do I think that you only have to have psychedelics to reach these states? No, no, no. I actually think that through hardcore levels of medication, through hardcore levels and dedicated time and effort to something like breath work, for example, as Tibetan monks would do, or various other practices within religion, or perhaps even certain Indian traditions, you will see that these certain hallucinations and divine communications are all possible. However, they take a lot of time. I think what psychedelics do is that they sort of bridge the gap very quickly. However, there's also a price to pay at that as well, and I feel that that price is entering those realms with an unprepared mind, which is something that can drift you into insanity, which back in 2014 was something that I was very worried that it could affect me. I never got to the point where I felt like I had a problem, but I always felt like, oh, okay, I can see that that's close. Now, how did I fix this? In case you are someone who's ever suffered from extreme HPPD, as I did, which is basically when you get extended visions, even in normal time when you are sober. The way I battled this was actually by fixing my diet, by doing weight training, and by introducing routines into my life, and by doing things under structure. Because what psychedelics do is that they introduce this new sheer power force of chaos within your mind. But that chaos has a lot of substance to it. However, that substance is useless unless you have the control and the power within your mind to control it. And it's kind of like having a lot of fuel, but without a proper engine to use the fuel. That's kind of the way I look at psychedelics, which is why, on one hand, I do wish that I had waited to get older to use them, because of course, I am much wiser now, supposedly. But I'm also grateful for the impact that they had, because the way I observe human beings and I connect with human beings is just different. And this is also how I observe the history of the world, how I look at myself, how I look at the universe. It is a very different thing now because of that. So, what are some of the general takeaways for this as we wrap up this episode? Let's talk about what's good about these psychedelics. They add an extreme amount of intelligence to you, or rather, more importantly, as I alluded to earlier, they unlock a very high degree of intelligence. They very much add to your intuition. And as I mentioned earlier, since my own experiences, I have become a far more kinder, a more compassionate person as a result, because it introduced thoughts into my head that allowed for those things that simply just did not exist before, or if they did, they were very much like a background thing. So these are the general positives that I would say. And also, I think it just brings us closer to a level of truth within the world. And where are we? Where are we living in? And I feel like had we at a scientific level not discouraged these things and not stopped the research for the 4 or 5 decades like we did, humanity would be in a much fucking better place for it right now. I sincerely believe that, and I feel vehemently opposed to those who halted this progress. So another thing as well that psychedelics is that they are not addictive. I think there's this unfortunate misconception that because they're a part of these other types of drugs, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning of this episode, you think that, oh, okay, there's just some drug and then you could get hooked on that thing and you want to take some mushrooms to take off the edge. No, motherfucker. If you get addicted to mushrooms, your brain must be made out of some fucking jet fuel or whatever. I don't know how anyone could ever get addicted to such a thing, because the experiences are so goddamn fucking intense and life altering. You don't even want to take them again for a while after you've had one. So it's absolutely asinine, and I think that the more we understand these things, the better we will understand nature, ourselves, and the world in general. And yes, we might be developing in technology, but if that technology is not in line with the understanding and the compassion and the alignment with nature, which we could attain, then that technology could be far more destructive than any good. And it feels to me like we're already seeing the side effects of that. And it almost feels like we're maybe even at a path of it being irreversible. However, I do feel that as a matter of urgency, perhaps some psychedelics are able to put us more in touch with nature. And I do not recommend, but I do wish that there was some possibility that at least everyone in the world could experience these things at least once or twice. And I mean everyone. So, what would be the negatives of psychedelics? Well, the negatives would be something like HPPD, which, like I said, is extended vision problems. The quality of product can be inconsistent depending on where it could be sourced from. There could be the cultural implications, as I said, that just because you feel like you can have psychedelics, then you might go and try other types of drugs such as cocaine, methamphetamine, speed, and so on, which that's not very good. There's the paranoia, and of course, I think the number one problem with them is the insanity. If you are someone who suffers from any kind of underlying mental health problems, such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia seems to be the main one. This is something that can possibly irreversibly push some people over the edge. And I think that's a very, very important thing to keep an eye out for. And this can be something that can even be genetically passed down to you. So you might not even know it, but then by having this substances in your system, you can activate these very terrible things within your own mind that you just have no lid over again. So what would be some of the best ways to do this and I guess avoid some of these terrible side effects? Well, as I keep stressing, is to do it with someone who is fully experienced on it, someone you feel comfortable with, someone you feel is there for you if you need them, and that you don't feel like you're hassling them, and that you're in a good setting where you've got access to things that you need. You don't feel like you're going to be disturbed, and you've got, again, very important, but you've got a music playlist which you like and enjoy, and perhaps even have different options for music playlists. Like for me, for example, if I wanted to do it, I would probably have one made up of stuff like Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd are always very popular for that, but one of my personal favorites, particularly during LSD, was Fields of the Nephilim, and I found that life-changing. But then you might want to go a bit fucking crazy and listen to some black metal, and I've done that too, and that actually can be pretty fascinating. I think Mysticum's Planet Satan's probably a very interesting record, because most people who listen to that album chat shit about how, those weird effects. Yeah, but those effects, if you take acid, you will understand why they sound the way they do, because they replicate a certain degree of impact, which perhaps one day, hopefully, I'll actually speak to one of the members of the band on this podcast about. Who knows? I might take that up at some point. If they'd be interested as well. But yeah, so the general consensus is you want to do it under careful circumstances, okay? And be careful of the dosage. And one more very important thing, there are testing kits you can order online that are made for specific different substances. And this can actually apply to other types of drugs as well. But I think there's these websites where you can legally buy testing kits for these things, and the thing for them is that they are a bit expensive. But I think that if you're wanting to try something like this, then you're going to take a big risk for your mind. So again, I'm not recommending that you do this, but if you are doing this, at least make sure that you test it and make sure that it is the substance that you're after that is in there and not something else. So do invest in a test kit is all I will say, because you might think, oh, I can get the thing itself for like 10 quid or whatever, but then, or $10, whatever, but then the test kit is $90. It is worth it because you're paying with your mind. You want something that's got quality, so don't fuck around. So, with that discussion wrapping up, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all very much for joining me on this wild rant on the on psychedelics, on my own experiences as well as opinions over these certain things. Was there anything that that you heard that you thought, oh, I totally disagree with that? That's bullshit. Shayan, what are you talking about? Or was there any things that you thought, I've never thought of that before, but now I'm going to look into it? Or was there anything that you thought, holy shit, I've had exactly that same experience or that same realization? If any of these are applicable to you, please let me know. This episode was a long time coming, and I think it ended up being quite long. I've not checked yet, but I appreciate you listening so far, and I'm curious. One of the main reasons why I'm putting this out there, other than simply provoking thoughts, which I feel are of importance, is to get an idea of how close we really are. Like how much have we all shared these kinds of experiences, had these realizations. Because to me, I feel that we're not living just to consume, just to keep overpopulating, or even just keep populating, if you want to look at it from that perspective. Just to consume, just to use, and just to abuse, and to simply burn out and die off. I do not believe in that. I do not believe in that reality of this world. I believe that ultimately there's got to be some kind of point to it all. But that point, I believe, whatever's gonna take us to it, I believe that psychedelics are a very, very, very crucial part of that conversation. And that will be besides our observation of human rights, of dignity, of technical advancement and science. I believe the psychedelics are a huge part in that, and I feel that unfortunately they are absurdly overlooked. And it's good that obviously more people are looking into this now, but I feel like it's very slow paced, and I wish that more people would talk about it. So rather than simply wish that people would talk about it, I made the decision to come here and talk about it myself. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that in mind, I thank you dearly for listening through this episode. I hope it's been of value to you, if it's been eye-opening, or if it's been thought-provoking, or if it's simply just got you through your day. I'm happy to have you here, and I appreciate you guys checking out Iblis Manifestations. So, hope you enjoyed this one. Once again, please let me know of your thoughts. What did you think? Am I full of shit? Or am I spreading dangerous misinformation? Or what? Do tell me. I'm curious to hear. But more importantly than that, at this time, is the next episode of the podcast is going to be an extremely special one. I think you guys will really enjoy it. I've got kind of a guest who is his first time appearing on the podcast, but he's kind of an obvious guest, which I think some of you have actually recommended before. So with some of the things happening in our camp at the moment, I figured now would be the best time to bring him on. So keep your eyes peeled on the next episode of Iblis Manifestations. Although I will say it's going to be a very intense one, and some of the stories shared there were actually pretty heartbreaking and gut-wrenching, and they're not for the weak-hearted. But it should provide you with some great insight into the world of Trivax. And that's where I'm going to leave that hint with. Ladies and gentlemen, I love you all. Thank you very much for tuning in to Bliss Manifestations. And I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.